So welcome everybody. This is our second meeting of the third round of Sustainable Tucson Ambassadors Training. And it's great to see you. We all will get to introduce ourselves in a different way today. We're going to do that through practicing the art of inquiry, which is one of the key skills to have as an ambassador, whether you are in international relations or local activism. A brief story. I was talking to the sustainability coordinator for the city of San Rafael, with whom I worked a number of years before moving to Tucson. And I was asking him what he appreciated most about his supervisor. And he said that she's a master communicator. And the example he gave was, she's the assistant city manager, and so always got plenty to do. And she tends to come into meetings 10 minutes late and then leave 10 minutes early. And yet she manages better than anybody else to capture what's being said in that meeting. And one of the things that she'll do is early on, she will say, now, let me make sure I understand. So what I've heard so far is this and this and this. Is that right? And then people would say, yeah, that's exactly where we're going. Or they say, well, you missed one part there. And she would do that periodically through the meeting. So through the art of summarizing, and often attached to a question, she was able to hone the conversation and keep the whole group on track, even though she was not the leader of the meeting. And this is an art of facilitation that we can all practice. One of the key aspects of that is the asking of questions. And so I'll tell you another vignette. You may have heard of Dale Carnegie, who is quite famous for his book on how to win friends and influence people. And he did emphasize also asking questions. The story went that a socialite in New York City had gone on a safari in Africa in a time when this was a less frequent occasion. And there was a party held for her to, just when she got back, kind of a welcome back party. And he happened to sit down next to her in dinner. And said, Mr. Carnegie, I hear that you are the best conversationalist in all of New York City. And he said, thank you very much. And I hear that you just got back from Africa. Which countries did you visit? Who went with you? What did you see? And so it went for 20 minutes. He learned all about her trip to Africa. And the next day in the newspaper, in the society column, the woman was quoted as saying, Dale Carnegie is indeed the best conversationalist in all of New York City. The point being that if you would like to have fun with someone, if you would like to connect with them, if you would like to learn with or from that person, questions are your friends. So today, the question we will ask of each other is, what's something you read or did on behalf of sustainability this week? And our discipline will be each of us to answer pretty briefly, maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 sentences, and then let your questioner ask one more question. And this is a very disciplined practice, because then you will not answer that question. You'll just say, yeah, I could go with that, or, well, it's not exactly where, I'm not sure what I would do with that. But so give some basic feedback to the person. And so to model this, I'm going to ask Anne the question, and she will just say a little bit about what she read or did on behalf of sustainability this week. And she'll be pretty brief. And then I will ask her a question which she will not answer. So Anne, what is something that you read or did on behalf of sustainability this week?
Miss Anne, you mean me? Well, as I had been away in France for 6 weeks, I began my early morning walks, my 5 o'clock in the morning walks with my friend Sharon, where we walk through the neighborhood and observe all the new native desert plantings. And that was wonderful to get an idea of the neighborhood that I live in.
So are you saying that you are happy just to get closer to the nature that is around you in Paris?
the nature that's around me here, having been away from it for 6 weeks in Paris, in a big city.
Ah, you're back.
I'm
Okay,
back. Oh, yes, I'm back.
okay.
I came back a few days ago.
Thank you, Anne. And we'll try to climb up the alphabet. Could you ask Bridget the same question, that same lead question?
Ask Bridget.
Yes.
Where's Bridget?
Raise your hand, Bridget.
Okay,
There she
hi,
is.
Bridget. Can you tell me something that you read or did this week that brought you closer to the notion of sustainability and the experience of sustainable life?
Yes. This week I was reading about essentially how to make bike lanes safer, or like any to make them more sustainable and more attractive for people to use. And what I was pretty much learning was I was reading about other countries that were implementing solar panels over their bike lanes in order to like generate electricity and also provide shade for their bikers. And it seemed like people were pretty happy about that. And yeah, that's what I was reading about.
So you linked the notion of sustainability this week with bike lanes and riding bikes and fostering bike riding in the city as a sustainable means of transport. And you found out how other countries are doing it.
Exactly.
A way that does more than just provide a bike lane.
Yes,
That's
definitely.
great.
Thank you both. And Anne is actually anticipating next week's angle, which is the empathic response, trying to reflect the content and or feeling of what someone said. So Bridget, could you inquire of, where's Christy? Are you here, Christy, still? There she is, yeah.
All right. Hey, Christy, what did you do or read about this week that got you closer to sustainability?
Well, I really enjoyed my homework, but what I did was emptied the last of my rainwater tanks onto my poor struggling trees because we got rain here. So I was happy they were emptied and ready for fresh rainwater. Very satisfying to feed your plants with rainwater.
So this week you're saying that you emptied your rainwater or your capture system essentially to be watering your plants.
Bridget, since we're going into the question, like getting more information, what could you ask her that would be interesting information about that situation?
Yeah, at least for me, like, how did you get your rainwater capture system set up?
Well, we put.
And you're not going to answer, Christy. You're just going to let her know if that question was a good one.
That's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you. So Christy, now I think it's Donna's turn to be inquired.
There she goes. Morning, Donna. What did you do this week to help you learn or do something sustainable?
We see your
Yes.
lips move, but we can't hear you. Now you're muted. Now you're really muted. Yeah.
Dear.
Yeah, you're really muted. Let's see. Maybe something's not connected.
She's got her earphones in.
Oh,
Maybe it's not in the plug that's speaker and microphone.
I heard some kid in a Zoom class made his name tag called technical difficulties. So that
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know.
does anyone have a handle on what might be working?
Did you check your microphone on the Zoom? Test it?
Oh, just test it. Donna, do you want to do that while we go on to the next person? And if we hear you, that'll just be a pleasant interruption. Yeah, just play around with it, Donna, and we'll let you know when we hear you.
Okay.
Now we hear
Now we're
you.
hearing her.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
I don't know what I,
Now we can't.
Yeah, there's something in the, must be, sounds like a wire is a little loose. You
Yeah,
could pause the recording, Trace, if you like. This, this will not be anything for posterity.
okay, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so hopefully you'll be able to continue to hear me. Anyway, okay, so I did a bunch of small things this week. As I mentioned, I'm working with Kevin on the Zero Waste Committee. And so I looked into Arizona laws around the issue of food waste, and also provided for a committee that Kevin and I are working on that's largely comprised of people from the Local First Arizona who are also thinking about food waste. So I gave them some resources. Let's see, I commented on a proposal for the BLM about the reintroducing beavers down at the Cienega Creek, and read an article on how Tucson's doing with their greening.
That all sounds wonderful. So I could think of a question now to ask her to get more information, right, Stuart?
Yeah.
So Donna, how did you touch base with all these wonderful groups like Zero Waste, Food Waste, Local First? You know, that would get us in conversation, correct?
Yeah, that would be a good question.
All righty, thank you.
Super. Well, Donna, why don't we backtrack? Can you ask David?
Yeah. So David,
Yes, I'm done.
what is something you did this week or read on behalf of sustainability?
I have a lot to choose from because that's just about all I worked on all week, including several calls with people who are working on addressing carbon and climate issues for the built environment. I also did some writing, reading and writing around these issues, and had a couple of meetings about potential changes to building codes related to that.
Yeah, so that's all really terrific. So I think that we would probably all love to know how you got started in this field and pursued this interest that you have.
Well, that's a really good question, and I'm going to be able to share some of that in a little while.
Great. Thank you.
Super. So I think now we'll shift to Janelyn. So David, you get to be her respondent.
So who is that?
Janelyn Schumann.
Hi.
Hi.
So what's something that you read or did on behalf of sustainability this week?
This week, my favorite thing that I did was I attended an Elder Action Network, the Elder Climate Action Group, offered a panel, and it's all generations in solidarity. And it was a part 1 of 2. And this week's was the screening I Am Greta. And then they had a panel. And I think what really touched me, well, I could get choked up about the screening itself, but I was so touched by how the youth put together this panel and the presence of elders and youth, and how they were talking about what they're doing and how they were relating to that screening. It was just so powerful. And it gives me so much hope when I see intergenerational conversation like that. It was very uplifting.
That's fantastic, and something I didn't know about. So I would be really interested in knowing more about that that group and how you got involved with them, and what else they're doing.
It would really be fun to do. I would enjoy that conversation. Thanks.
Right. Well, Janelyn, can you ask Laura?
Okay, Laura. Let me see if I see you.
Laura Key, she's somewhere there. I see her hand waving.
Could you wave? Oh, there you are. Hi, Laura. What did you read or do this week on behalf of sustainability?
Well, I wrote a few letters to elected officials about a sustainability matter. I collected signatures for Arizonans for Fair Elections. I rode my bike on a few errands for the first time in 3 months or more, and started in on a 5-year volunteer commitment I made recently related to tree planting, and set up my seasonal outdoor shower. It's a sophisticated system. That was sarcastic at the end.
Well, I would love to hear more about that. Your shower sounds very intriguing. And it'd be fun to hear about how you got started with your letter writing, how you got into a groove. It's something I've really wanted to be better at.
Well, those letters were not part of a group, but those sound like great questions. Who's next, Stuart?
Kevin, actually, we're going to step back in the alphabet.
Back to the alphabet. Hey, Kevin, what is something you read or did this week on behalf of sustainability?
Well, as you all know, the City of Tucson's started work on developing climate action and adaptation plan, and they had a workshop a couple of weeks ago, their first community workshop. So I've been researching climate action plans, in particular plans that have been developed by the consultant that has been hired by the city. So I've been researching and looking for plans that they develop for other communities to see what the contents were of those plans, the framework scope. But I'm also wanted, because I work on the zero waste issues, I wanted to see if those plans had made zero waste or smart materials management a key priority or focus of the climate action plan, because that's something I want to be able to make the case to the City of Tucson. You've got to have a big section on zero waste in your climate action plan. And guess what? The consultants you've hired, they've done exactly that for other communities, City of West Hollywood and the Washington, D.C. Council of Governments.
That is super interesting. I was actually also at that first input meeting. I was not impressed by the consultants' application of the ICA facilitation methods, and would be super curious to find out more about what they've done elsewhere. I'm sorry, I'm supposed to ask a question, not just comment. What did you find out about other cities' climate action plans?
Well, I'd love to share that information with you at some point.
Awesome.
Good. Well, we've got a lot of activists here. Kevin, I think you will, let's see, jumping around, but I think Marta's your next person.
Hi, Marta. What have you done this week, with respect to sustainability? Something you've read or something you've actually done? Can you share with us?
So I was swamped with work this week, but I did some kind of noticing of themes that were raised at our last session and kind of follow up. So I work in marketing, and it was interesting because one of the communities that we market essentially, or we do marketing for in Marana, I was reading some of their material, and I noticed mentions of dry wells and kind of landscaping that allowed for wastewater runoff to go in that direction. And I was like, oh, wow. And I don't think normally I would have noticed that word, or just thought, oh, okay, it wouldn't have registered. So that was interesting. And I'm like kind of tagging for follow-up to learn more about what that system is where they are. And I had some conversations with people just, about what we learned, and did some research online. And I found a video series, which is really interesting, out of Arizona Cooperative Extension, all about our water, our groundwater. So if anyone's interested, I'd be happy to share it.
Well, I'd certainly like to talk to you more about marketing and the role that marketing can play in promoting sustainable behavior, sustainable activities at some point. Sounds like you have some good expertise in that area.
That would be a cool conversation.
What's one question you might ask her, Kevin, that she won't answer this morning, but what's one question?
Oh, well, I thought I asked a question. Actually, I basically, what is the role that you can see marketing playing to improve our efforts to promote sustainable behaviors in the community?
In fact, just for the fun of it, Marta's smiling, so that was a good question. What if we all type a question into the chat box? Let's see how many different questions could be asked of Marta. So Marta, if you could address Richard.
Hi, Richard. What's something you read or did this week on behalf of sustainability?
Hi, Marta. Thanks for your question. I'm really actually very grateful that I actually did something this week related to sustainability. Looking at the questions in advance, I'm thinking, oh shit, what am I going to come up with? If I was thinking if I didn't come up with anything, I would have said that I did a lot of weeding around my yard, which I thought was pretty useful, keeping the yard sustainable. But I did actually do a couple other things. I'll probably forget them if I even remember them. One was I was talking to a woman who runs a series of trainings on climate change and sustainability using systems thinking and progressive economics and earth sciences. So that was really interesting to me. And that's enough for now, since I already forgot one of the other things.
Wow, that's really interesting. I would be curious to know what were your key takeaways from that conversation, and how systems thinking informed her perspectives on sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'll be glad to post the website for this organization that runs these trainings every quarter.
Very cool. Thanks, Richard.
Now, Richard, Paula is hovering in the Sustainable Tucson Zoom account window. So could you ask Paula?
What did you say?
Paula, there's Paula who's appeared in the ST
Oh,
Zoom
there's
account.
Paula. Oh, I think there was a guy on that account last time, wasn't there?
Yeah, Trace.
We're both here. We're both here.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, hi Paula, because the name on your account says ST Zoom account.
That's because Trace manages the Zoom account. So, yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes
great.
he changes to Trace and Paula, but not today.
Well, at least I got to remember Trace's name now that a couple people have said it. So Paula, what did you do this week that somehow relates to sustainability?
Well, I guess the first thing was what we do virtually every week. I went to the farmer's market for really great local produce, and did my bread shopping locally to support the local grain industry by going down to Barrio Bread. I'm big on local food, and I don't know. I've been reading a bunch in the paper. There seem to be articles almost every day related to something connected to sustainability. The one that sticks out most is some serious writing from Tony Davis about what's going on with Hud Bay, and keeping my fingers crossed that they can block all that horrible mining planning for south of here.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I would love to know more about how you relate to farmers markets and the community of people that you get to experience there. And
no, it's something I love to talk about. So that would be a fun question.
Great, thanks.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
Paula, could you, let's see, I keep losing. You think, there is Stephen. Could you ask Stephen?
Stephen, I know you're there somewhere. Hi,
Yeah,
Stephen.
I'm here.
So, Stephen, what did you read or do this week that relates to sustainability?
Well, one of the things I'm really interested in is passive storage of renewable energy to use it later. And I ran into some really interesting material on using that sustainable energy that's generated in excess in a locality to store compressed air. That compressed air then can be used later on to drive a turbine. So I thought that was really interesting.
Oh,
And
wow.
it reminded me of something a system I designed one time to lift up a heavy weight by using excess energy and then having that weight drive a generator as it falls down.
Wow, you are always involved in some really intriguing things. I would love to know more about the way of storing energy, the techniques for storing it, and maybe using it for whether it's neighborhoods or cities or larger areas, or if it's something that might be applicable at a home-based level.
Yeah, those are good questions. Yeah, we could go on a long way about all of this.
Yeah. Yeah, great, thanks.
Stephen, you can ask me.
Oh, you're next. Okay. All right, Stuart, is there something that you did or read concerning sustainability this week that was particularly of interest to you?
Yes, like David, quite a bit of things, like a lot of you. And what stands out is I'm in California, so it's a lot of vacation, but there's a lot of conversations with friends who happen to be involved in sustainability. So I had some really good talks with a city sustainability coordinator, a former county supervisor's aide, and the head of Sustainable San Rafael, and his wife, who founded the Resilient Neighborhoods program. So I just learning all kinds of things. But then I just talked yesterday with the chief of strategy for Pima Community College, and I'm in consultation with her on the development of their climate action, or their climate and sustainability plan, which is really an impressive document.
Sounds like you have a great circle of contacts to help get things. How do you go about setting that up? I assume that's a long-term process.
Thank you. I would love to answer that question. So I say that is a really spot-on question. And I'm going to turn to Trace. Trace, what's one thing? Yeah, what's one thing that you're glad you did or read about sustainability this week?
Well, I went with Paula to the farmer's market and I eat the food we buy there. And I actually was able to harvest a little bit of something from my garden. That's a lifelong struggle. This is almost the first time I've successfully grown anything, and it's barely. So it's a 40-year process to learn how to grow anything. So that's one thing. And I've been working on a few other projects for Sustainable Tucson as well.
Well, the question I would ask is, what did you learn? What did you do differently that this time something really grew successfully?
Nothing that I can think of. It's an ongoing struggle.
One person who's been steering us with all kinds of information is David Eisenberg. He co-founded, or he founded the Development Center for Appropriate Technology, and has just a number of credits to his name. I'll just say briefly a couple of things. One is that they launched a program called Building Sustainability into the Codes in 1995. And their mission was to create a sustainability context for building codes all across the country. So they weren't just going to do sustainable building themselves. They wanted to build that into the culture. He was troubleshooting construction of the high-tech cover of the Biosphere 2. He's worked with Strawbale, Adobe, rammed earth, wood, steel, masonry. He co-authored the Strawbale House Book and has worked extensively on building codes since then, and recently contributed to some coding relative to hempcrete, which is a more sustainable form of having concrete because you've got hemp matter in there, which reduces the cement, which is of course a very high energy item. He serves on the board of Sustainable Tucson and the Tucson 2030 district. And David, I think we'll probably still take our break at 11. So thank you for bearing with us as we went a few minutes more than originally planned.
So, I want to still briefly, the things that that Stuart talked about. I was a builder. I've referred to myself as a recovering contractor, and it's more than a 12-step program for contractors. But anyway, I got involved in Strawbale construction and earth and building, and observed how difficult it was for people to get building permits for these alternative projects. And I observed something else, which was that the more sustainable something was that people were trying to do, the harder it was to get a permit for it, which seemed crazy to me. But in fact, that was kind of the reality. Anyway, this led me into all manner of things that I didn't anticipate doing. I want to just point out briefly that quote, which I think is an all-time, maybe the best quote ever. Our greatest responsibility is to be good ancestors. Jonas Salk said that. And I often when I'm presenting to building officials and groups of people like that, I start and end with that quote, because I think it creates exactly the context within which, I want people to think about what we're doing and what it means. Anyway, much of the work I've done over the last 10, 15 years has been on trying to develop building codes and get them adopted for what people call alternative materials. And so these are some, so this is from the 2021 national, it's called the International Residential Building Code. And you can see that in 2015, we got Strawbale construction in the code. That took 20 years. The same year we got light straw clay into the code. That happened in one code cycle. that took less than a year. And we've been learning along the way. In 2018, we worked on and got approved the tiny house appendix. In 2021, the Cobb construction appendix. We just got approved the hempcrete appendix, and for the 2024 code. And we're now working with Cal Earth Institute and the people who developed, it's similar to earth bag construction, if you've seen that, but Super Adobe uses long tubes rather than individual bags. And we're working with some people who are looking for research funding to do shake table tests and a lot of other structural and other research to develop an appendix for that building system. I'll say something very briefly about the name of my nonprofit Development Center for Appropriate Technology, which is, there's a kind of classic definition of appropriate technology, which is that it's the simplest or lowest tech, system or thing you can do to do whatever it is you're trying to do. And I think the best definition is that it's technology that ordinary people can use for their own benefit and the benefit of their community, that doesn't make them dependent on systems over which they have no control. And if you unpack that, it's really about enhancing the local capacity to meet local needs or regional. And appropriateness has to do with context, where you are, what you're trying to do, what resources are available, et cetera, all kinds of things that fit into that. And I want to point out the DCAT website, dcat.net, we've not been able to update that thing for a few years. And I'm in the process of, I'm just initiating or about to initiate a process of creating a new website. In the meantime, there's a DCAT group on Facebook, and I'm going to share, I'm going to make this available as a PDF file so that you don't have to try and copy down all these links, because there's a lot of links in this presentation that are worth being able to access. Anyway, I've been posting more recent stuff on the Facebook DCAT group, just so it's and you can post there. You can share things, you can ask questions, etc. So I mentioned, and hopefully, boy, you know what I think I'm going to do? I'm going to postpone sharing Bob's or some of what Bob Vint would have been talking about till I'm done with my presentation, because I don't want to get back into that whole scenario of trying to figure out how to do this. But yeah, so I'll talk about this in a bit. I also want to share with you, in case you didn't, how many of you were on the monthly meeting when Mats Bierman and Joe Sillens and I did the Strawbale presentation? It's available now. There's a link from the Sustainable Tucson website. One of the really nice things about the video of that is it includes all the Q&A that happened at the end as well. And it has there's some overlap with what I'm going to talk about here, but mostly I'm not going to talk about that stuff because there's already a really good resource for that's available through Sustainable Tucson. Hooray. So I do want to talk about where we're at and things we need to be concerned about. So a couple of years ago, this report came out and it identified Tucson as the third fastest warming city in the country. And that should be a concern. And so that needs to play into a lot of how we think about housing and everything else. And one of the things I want to put the things I'm going to talk about into this bigger perspective, because there's been a real shift in understanding what's important about the climate impact of buildings. And that shift has to do with the fact that, first of all, a lot of those impacts, and not just climate, but environmental and other impacts, happen long before the building is ever built, and they extend way out into the future as well. And yet we've been focused almost entirely when we talk about buildings and climate, buildings and impacts on, the operating, the use phase, of buildings. And when we talk about climate change and buildings, we're focused on those operating emissions, basically what's happening from the energy that we're using to power our buildings. And so now we're talking about, trying to get to net zero or even net positive energy, operating energy. But it's actually a smaller, it's very important, but it's a small piece of what we need to be paying attention to. And one of the things that happened over the years, we used to talk about embodied energy of buildings. And what we were talking about was essentially all the energy and the impacts from that energy that it took, to be able to build a building, get the resources, mining, et cetera, manufacturing, processing, transportation, all of that stuff, that goes into being able to build the building. And most of my friends who are focused on energy were focused on energy efficiency. And I used to get into these discussions with them about that embodied energy was insignificant, basically, compared to operating energy, because, typically they would say it was in the 10, 12, 15%, of the life cycle, the whole energy impact, of a building over its whole life. And I would say, well, operating energy is huge. Embodied energy looks small in comparison, but it's not small. Embodied energy is really, it's a big number made to look small by the size of the operating energy. But one of the things to understand is that we've started talking about carbon instead of energy and embodied carbon. So now we're talking about, mostly people are talking about the emissions related, it's similar to talking about embodied energy emissions, but they're mostly thinking about operating emissions and not the embodied earlier, impacts. And they're talking about net zero operating energy as though that's great, but it's not great if you've increased the embodied emissions in order to get to net zero or better. So we need to pay attention to that. So here's a, excuse me, here's a graphic, of the carbon life cycle of buildings. So starting at the top on the right side, raw material extraction, manufacture, transfer. So these are the usual things that you think about in the life cycle of a building. And so you build it, you operate it, you fix it, upgrade it, et cetera. And at the end of the life, you demolish it or, recycle it or whatever happens to it. And if we're smart, we reuse it. We don't throw away all that embodied impact and resources. But what we've been doing is focusing on that one part and ignoring this other part. And so this just is pretty much what I've been talking about, that there's more to it. And one of the other critical things about it is that it's been changing, and so is our thinking. So if, in those early discussions, we were talking about embodied energy as being that small percentage of the overall energy, because these buildings weren't very efficient and operating energy was high. But as we've improved the energy efficiency of buildings, the percentage of the overall impact of the embodied impact goes up. Like if you think about a net zero operating energy building, then you're not increasing through the operation the impact. You basically are looking at the main impact of the building is what it's taken to build it, right? And you're not increasing it over time. And so this is for, different kinds of buildings and efficiencies of buildings. But when you look at this more carefully, you start to see that these impacts, the time aspect is really important. So what this graphic is showing is, this is for a high efficiency, a high performance building, that the Architecture 2030 has basically estimated that high performance buildings, 60%, roughly 60% of the impact is embodied and 40% is from the operation, but that grows over time. And so the total, at the end of the life of the building, is that cumulative, impact that started with the embodied impact and then grew. But if you look at what they're showing here, a high performance building built in 2015, by 2030, the embodied emissions are still much larger than the operating emissions. And by 2050, they're still bigger, which means that what we're doing when we build these high efficiency buildings, if we're not paying attention to the climate impact of what we're using, how we're building them, the materials, et cetera, is that we're actually bringing the impacts to the present and not having them grow over time. So we really need to pay a different kind of attention. And so this is really shifting people's thinking. I'm going to skip this slide because
David, while you're shifting, I'm noticing it's 11 o'clock. Would this be an all right time for us to take a 5-minute break for body
let me
comments?
do a couple more slides, and then it will be a good time, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Okay. So one of the things that's really important to understand is that there are two. So when we talk about embodied carbon, most people are talking about the embodied climate impact, and it's often referred to as CO2e, which is carbon dioxide equivalents. And we do that because there are other climate impacts besides carbon and carbon dioxide to look at, but also this is a method to try and get all the things we're measuring into the same context so that we can compare things and have an understanding of what the climate impacts are of different aspects of these buildings that we're designing and building. So there's those emissions, the carbon emissions or their equivalents, but there's also physically embodied carbon in the materials that we're actually using in buildings. And so if you think about bio-based materials, especially those that are coming from regenerative agriculture, it's actually possible not only to take this carbon and sequester it in the building, but it's also possible to sequester more carbon in the soil through better agricultural practices. So when we're growing things, straw, hemp, wood, etc., these materials have the potential as building materials to actually put carbon into the buildings, into high performance buildings, actually, and offset the other impacts. And this is a really exciting area that's starting to change. The Architecture 2030, the 2030 Challenge, they have this carbon smart material palette on their website. And one of the things that's really interesting is if you look at this graphic, these are emissions. So high density spray foam, medium density, they're huge emissions. So these materials that we're using to make high performance buildings actually have big climate impacts. And you see that other kinds of foam have smaller impacts, and fiberglass has an impact. But then you get to things like, well, denim bats, reusing, recycling cotton from clothing, etc. Look at wool. These are insulation materials that are sequestering carbon. And look at what's the biggest one, Strawbale. And what's really interesting is that when people have started really looking at this, they've discovered that you can actually build carbon negative buildings if you're careful with how you design and what materials you use. And this is something new that's reverberating out through the whole design and building realm in the climate in the climate focused areas, and it's having an impact and a really positive one. And some of my really good friends are central players, in figuring this out, in seeing it for the first time and then sharing it. So this is a good place to stop, to take our break.
David, before you start, I have a real quick question on the wool insulation. Where does that wool come from?
It's been a few years since I actually paid attention to wool insulation.
Oh, okay.
Right. It shouldn't be hard to find out, though. And actually, one of the things that's happening that reminds me about, that I might not have otherwise said anything about, is that there's over the last few years, there's been a process developed. They're called environmental product declarations, and they're basically life cycle impact analyses of a given product or material, and they're available for a lot of things, and they're what is being used now to determine whether, sort of what the impacts or benefits of different materials are. And this is a global thing that's happening, which is really important. And so for something like wool, you could go online and see if you can find an environmental product, an EPD, environmental product declaration for wool insulation.
Thanks, David.
You'll probably be able to find it and find out sort of from some manufacturers anyway where the wool is coming from. Good question.
So David, we've got till 11:20 on our schedule for you were talking to us, and then we were going to go into a full out question and answer. So our time is short, but we're all ears.
I'll move ahead. So this slide shows a number of things that are happening in different, with different materials, and concrete is a worldwide. The numbers I've seen range from about 6 to 8% of CO2, global CO2 emissions from Portland cement. And one of the great things is there's been a lot of work done on changing that. And so there are some really good efforts out there to dramatically reduce the climate impact of cement, and with alternatives, with different processes, et cetera. So there's even Marin County, California, developed the first low carbon concrete code. And it's being copied in other places, but you need a lot of information, local or regional information, to be able to do that. the Bay Area has that. A lot of places don't. Let's see, I'm having to remember how I advance my slides here. So I was mentioning that you know, that there's all this work happening on making buildings carbon sinks instead of sources. And my friends Bruce King and Chris Magwood have just written this book, which is a fabulous resource on this whole changing understanding of how we get to real carbon zero or better buildings, with a lot of really great research in it. And things are happening in Europe that are kind of mind-boggling. Straw has become an ever more mainstream building material, and a lot of that's happening with prefabricated systems for commercial and institutional buildings, and that's a huge benefit in terms of efficiency, affordability, performance, etc., and accessibility. And so things in Europe have really taken off in the realm of using straw as an insulating material. And so there are a lot of really good resources these days that were never there before. And finally, you know, the federal government is starting to actually invest in some of these things, and they could invest a whole lot more. I've been trying to get the federal government to create a regenerative resources laboratory, national laboratory, like the Forest Products Lab that exists for wood, for the wood industry. But we need that kind of investment. There are more and more, unlike when we started working on this stuff 20 years ago or more, you know, there are more and more good information resources out there. And and studies that show, for one thing, existing buildings are really, we have a lot of them, and most of them need work. And there's no reason, in many cases, the best thing, well, it's been said, the most sustainable building you can build is the one that you don't have to build. And so repurposing buildings, upgrading buildings, again, doing them consciously, you know, understanding the impacts of our choices in materials and design, et cetera, all important. But there's more and more evidence that this stuff is doable and it can have an impact. I like to show this little set of pictures from Mats Merriman and Judy Knox's, well, the house next door to where they lived years ago. This little, really hard to heat and cool concrete block house that they wrapped with straw bales and added a porch, a wraparound porch, and made it beautiful and beautifully performing from an energy standpoint. It was really amazing transformation. And, you know, these opportunities exist. I want to talk some about our existing housing stock. And I think it's really important that if you have a house and you're thinking about doing it, you know, energy upgrades, it's really a good idea to start with an energy audit, to really have people who know something about building performance and building science, you know, look at it, but also look at the site for ways that you can utilize landscaping to, you know, add shade to create microclimates, et cetera, and also, look at water harvesting opportunities and passive strategies, keeping heat out in the summer and letting it in the winter. It's nice that the sun actually moves, from straight overhead or slightly to the north to the south in the winter, and you can design using that. It's been done for millennia. Also, there are a bunch of like that house that Motts and Judy wrapped in bales. There are a lot of, like my own house, uninsulated masonry houses that were built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. They started insulating them on the inside, furring out, putting a little bit of fiberglass insulation and drywall on the inside, but that's a poor way to do it, because essentially you're leaving the thermal mass out there in the winter to get hot all day and radiate that heat into the house all night, or get cold at night and draw heat out of the house as well. So the same amount of insulation on the outside of a thermal mass wall system creates an enormous improvement in the thermal performance of that assembly, way more than having that same insulation on the inside. And one of the interesting things in thinking about that is a lot of these old houses need work. The electrical systems and plumbing needs to be upgraded, and if you're wrapping the outside of your house, not necessarily with straw bales, but with other insulating materials, hopefully not foam, there's an opportunity to actually do that, those upgrades on the outside and go through the wall, and upgrade your electrical or your plumbing, and still have those insulated within the insulation on the outside, less disruption of the inside of your house to do that kind of work. And you can also add insulation to your roof, and when you're re-roofing, that's another opportunity to do similar things. And you can think about, if that's the time to really think about rainwater harvesting, think about the materials you're using and whether they're going to be safe for the water that's collected off the roof. It's a good time to put on gutters, to get cisterns, etc. And also you can use elastomeric, reflective roof coatings to both extend the life of a roof, but also really increase the performance, reduce the heating loads in the summer, and so that's what we're doing. You can think about extending overhangs or using vegetation to create more shade. Excuse me, more shade. I love this Brad Lancaster, who some of you undoubtedly know about. He converted this little garage into what he calls a garrotage, a little cottage. But one of the things he did was to graphically, physically demonstrate different sun angles for passive heating and cooling, basically. And he used like seasonal, like during the summer, he used a fishing pole to show the angle of the sun during the summer. In the winter, it's like a ski pole. And I forget what he used, golf clubs, I think, for sort of mid-season. But anyway, he was just showing, he put these things on his little garrotage to show the different sun angles and how you can design your window openings, to be shaded in the summer and to let the winter sun in, for heat gain. One more little clever thing.
David,
yeah.
this is also fascinating, and we're running up against our time limit.
Yeah,
I wonder whether we could open up for some questions and then see if there's time for a few more pictures and commentary.
sure. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Well, let me say something about this. One of the things that's emerged in the last few years as a way to deal with older houses that don't have central air conditioning systems are the what they call ductless mini split air conditioning systems. They're pretty, you can get really high efficiency ones. And instead of running ducts, you basically have the condensing unit that's outside the air conditioning unit that does the work. But basically the cooling or heating is coming in pipes that are fairly easy to install. And so you can have the air handling units, in different rooms without having to figure out how to install ductwork and other things. And this is becoming a good way to go about doing that. Now, why don't we open it up? There's tons more stuff we could talk about.
There's always more, and it's so relevant. Let me seed the conversation with the question that I wrote, and then I'm inviting everybody. You can just unmute or raise your hand or put it in the chat. So for the question, are straw bales part of the embodied carbon in a building? In other words, they are carbon, they're in the building. So is that indeed part of the embodied carbon? And if so, is that considered a good?
Yeah, so if you think about a building that's using, so straw bales in a building are serving multiple purposes typically. One is, it's the infill material, substrate for finishes, plaster, etc. They can be structure as well. They can be used as load bearing, a load bearing element that's actually supporting the roof. Or they can just be infill and insulation, but they're part of the building. And so the carbon that's in them, is a benefit. And if you think about one of the things, gosh, I hope I can remember if I may not have included this. There is a new a new tool called BEAM, which is a building emissions. I forget what the A stands for. It's a calculator that basically lets you look at all the different materials that are going into a building in their quantities, and gives you an impact kind of score for the building. You can see how substituting one insulation for another or one roofing system for another, affects the overall climate performance of that building. And my friend Chris Magwood has been behind the creation of that tool. It includes a whole bunch of alternative materials that many people wouldn't think are mainstream, but are the kinds of materials like hemp, bamboo, straw, etc., that are going to make a big difference in the future. And so, yes, straw is part of the building. It's part of the embodied carbon, and it's a benefit.
Thank you, David. And Laura put a comment in suggesting to let you keep rolling, because we are definitely interested. Why don't we take a question from Stephen, whose hand is up, and then David,
Okay.
then up to, let's say, 11:40.
Okay.
I was just wondering, David, thinking about straw, and you talked about regenerative agriculture with it. But I look at that as maybe not total benefit because that's carbon that's not going back into the soil.
So, yeah, so this is a really good and a very interesting thing when looking at straw. One of the things that was happening a lot, still happens in a lot of the country, is that after the harvest, they burn the field, which is not great for the climate or air quality, etc. But yes, that carbon theoretically can go back into the field, but it's not, it isn't necessarily needed. One of the things that there's a great decades-long, multiple decades-long research project that Wes Jackson has been doing at the Land Institute in Kansas, which is basically creating through old breeding techniques perennial grains, not annuals, but perennial grains. And the advantage of that is, well, it's multifold. One is you're not reseeding these fields every year, and plowing them up and doing all that stuff. But another is that these grains have much deeper root systems. And the root systems are really where carbon is getting sequestered in the soil in a very significant way. And so, there's all this work being done that's like finally looking at a much more systemic and integrated view of, where things are coming from, where they're going, what's happening to them, what those impacts mean, and what they mean where and to what and to whom, etc. So it's a really good question. It's sustainable agriculture, industrial agriculture, has lots of problems, and finding better ways to do all of these things, are necessary.
Yeah,
Are you?
Was that at K-State or are you KU?
I'm sorry. Say that again.
That study at K-State or KU?
It's actually the work that Wes Jackson has been doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the Land Institute.
The Land Institute. Okay. All right.
In Kansas. He and Wendell Berry and then a whole bunch of people have been working on a lot of these issues for a long time. And that's all. It's another topic that we could spend lots of time on. But that's what's that? Oh yeah, my wife reminds me that Wes Jackson's books are excellent also.
Okay, well, David, we've got about 8 more minutes if you'd like
Okay,
to
well,
just roll through.
let me cruise through a few things here. Evaporative cooling, a lot of people talk about it. We have it. It's great and problematic all at the same time. We're entering the time of year when it becomes much less efficient because of humidity, but it's less energy intensive, less costly, less impactful to build an evaporative cooler than an air conditioner. But it uses water. And so does so do air conditioners. They use water from the energy generation end of the system. So there's this thing that we talk about, the energy water nexus, which basically is that typically getting water requires a bunch of energy, and producing energy generally requires a bunch of water. So if you're saving energy, you're saving water. If you're saving water, you're saving energy. The two things are often connected and worth thinking of that way. So let's see. I keep trying to advance this the way I usually do. One of the other things just to pay attention to, if you're upgrading an older house, it's really important to pay attention to things like lead in paint, asbestos, mold. All these things they're real issues, and they need, you need to think about them and act appropriately if they exist in your house. And I won't go into that in any depth, but there are also, some really good resources for remodeling. And again, this will all be available to you, so you can see these things at your leisure at some point in the not too distant future. But this is one of Trace's big issues is we have all these old houses and they need all this work, and how in the world can we afford to do that individually or as a community? And there are a lot of big conversations, I think, that need to be had around this issue. I've been thinking about some of this stuff. One of the things I've been thinking about, Trace has been talking about the potential, because if you look at Tucson, they're neighborhoods that were subdivisions that were built by the same developer, and they're very similar. And he's been suggesting that we should maybe focus our efforts at rehabbing these buildings, looking at them and saying, here's 1,000 houses that are very similar and that are the same age, and their systems are failing, in similar ways. And can we optimize, the upgrade of those houses as a group? And I've been thinking about along those lines, what if we created some neighborhood purchasing co-ops, or, like what if we started thinking, in a more community-oriented way about how we can get the cost down? What if we created some for-profit worker-owned businesses that were doing this work? There are just a lot of things like that we could start thinking about. What if we created, if we did a bond issue, to create a low interest revolving loan fund, so that people could have access to affordable credit to do it. There's a long-standing thing I've been focused on, which has to do with energy dollars. Like all the money that, if you think about the money we spend on energy, most of it leaves town immediately, probably 60 or 70% of it. It doesn't stay local. So that's this wealth continually bleeding out of the community. Well, what if we had an energy dollar dashboard that showed us where that money was going, and how much, and that we could actually see that. We could begin to talk about renewable energy and energy efficiency as an economic development engine, a local economic development engine. We could think about these jobs and businesses as part of that. So there's a whole bunch of things we could potentially do that could shift the economics involved. It's challenging. It's gonna be challenging, but we need to challenge it collectively to really think about how we get out of where we are. And so, yeah, those are some ideas. There's more resources. There's a whole bunch of resources, like a fire hose worth of information, but it's all available, in this presentation that you'll have access to. And so this is my nonprofit, and we can spend as much time as you want talking.
You've-
And according to my computer, it's 11:39. So
Yeah. You have fired our imaginations and hopefully cooled our thoughts as well. Laura put a question into the chat, and that's leading the way because we're going to go into breakout rooms for a few minutes, and we're going to do two things. With each person contribute at least one key point or question that you would like David to address. And then if you would like to propose one action that you would like the city or other jurisdiction to take on. And this will be, again, a disciplined exercise because we've got 15 minutes. And David's going to hang around. Actually, David, I think you'll be in one of those groups, which will be fun. We'll be mostly in pairs. There'll be one trio. And so please keep your eye on the top of the breakout room. It'll tell you when you've got 1 or 2 minutes left. It'll be not enough time. It never is. But some say think fast, move fast. But let's see how this goes. So I'm going to invite you to enter the breakout room. Here it comes. Again, one question and or one take-home idea. Laura's already got a question, so that's there. Got to jump there. And one policy that you would like the city or others to adopt. Now, each group gets a chance. It'll be a brief chance to share your question or your idea or your proposal for a city policy or other. If someone has already posed that question, then you can just simply say, yeah, just like they said. Okay. Brevity is indeed the soul of wit, as the great bard said. So let's start with Trace. Who are you with?
We were with Carolyn Christie, and she lives in Sierra Vista, I believe. Paula can.
Yeah, Christy's down in Sierra Vista in an adobe home, which was interesting to hear about. And she was wondering how we can teach people about some of these new materials and techniques without, scaring them. And people seem very hesitant to try something new. And so one of the things that I suggest is that we really need the city or the county or Sustainable Tucson to do some teaching. Things like the kind of information that David can provide in really easily digestible amounts to get people aware of what the possibilities are, particularly possibilities for energy efficient repair of older homes. And maybe what we need in Sustainable Tucson is a committee working on housing issues and what could be done to start up getting the information out through tours, through talks, through other ways of getting the information out.
That sounds quite clear and substantive. Paula, would you be willing, do you have notes it looks like, would you be willing to be the recorder for just this part of the conversation so that we have a record of people's questions and suggestions?
Sure, I'll try.
Thank you so much. Okay, because we don't want to forget these. All right, Richard, how about you and your group?
And we're recording, right?
See, Richard. There
Hey,
you go.
I'm unmuted. Yes, I was with Janelyn, and I know Janelyn was excited about all the possibilities that David talked about, the what ifs. And I think what struck me was like, I guess the idea of, there's retrofitting and there's new building. Both of them cost money. And I don't know, I wouldn't really know what the percentage is of how many house owners in Tucson have enough money to do retrofits. And I'm assuming a lot of them don't. I don't know, maybe 50-50. I don't know. Maybe it's not as good as that. So I'm thinking, maybe we have to look at things in two ways. One is to how to get people who have money to do things to support the environment. And then we have to figure out how to support the people that don't have money, which has got to be a lot of people in there because, to make their houses better, to save energy and stuff.
Thank you, Richard and Janelyn, both. Let's see, Stephen, could you share what you and your partner discussed? Or your partner, whoever.
I was with Laura, and we focused mostly on retrofitting, and we explored David's idea of a revolving loan or a bond issue. And Laura made the point that we could do it on a thing like microloans, but then that wouldn't maybe get us as good a rate on the loans to start with as having a neighborhood or a little larger group. But we like the idea of having a fund that the loans are paid back by the people who get them back into the fund as they do with sustainable housing or microloan programs.
Thank you. Marta, I think you had a plan?
Yeah, and
present?
Kevin had a question. Kevin, do you want to lead with the question and then I'll jump in the plan?
Sure. The question I had was, who are the players that need to be brought together from the public sector, contractors, nonprofits, and others that need to come to the table to develop some policies and programs collaboratively? Otherwise, we just don't think it's going to work if it doesn't have buy-in, strong buy-in from the community. But I'll turn it over to Marta, who has more of a policy proposal for you.
So my sense is with a lot of these different things, there's so many possibilities, but they can feel overwhelming in terms of information and calculations and steps. And that a lot of the retrofit things that people do are piecemeal, like, oh, my roof is leaking, this needs fixing. And the planning and the processing doesn't happen, even if someone has the best intentions. And I think it would be really useful. And I guess there is a question relationship to this, which is, a training process related to performance of buildings, like to do that audit, right? What are training programs for that? For building performance. And secondly, the need to have some sort of service that allows someone to come out to a house and say, okay, you can do this and this and this and this, a phased plan that is affordable, maybe run by the city, so that people can actually begin to imagine this without being responsible for reading 500 books, doing calculations, which is probably outside of the realm of their expertise. So facilitating with efficiency and resources, some sort of clearinghouse and service that allows people to do the right thing if they want to, and people who may not even want to get to know what options are there. Because I think right now we're relying too heavily on personal initiative when people need something affordable, fast, not overwhelming, that can help them do the right thing.
Thank you, Marta, for that. Thank you, Paul, for recording these ideas so we won't forget them.
And I'll check against the recording if I have questions and what I've written down.
Super. Bridget, how about your pair?
Yeah, so I was talking to David, and a big portion of what we were talking about is like new buildings that are being built, especially when it comes to like downtown Tucson, whether that's student housing or just higher rises. And David was saying that, mid-rise apartments or living situations can be very beneficial and very, very energy efficient, but obviously they create like transit problems. And then also just kind of going along with city growth, there's a lot of there's like our heat. There's a lot of heat that's captured within the concrete, and how really pushing, and I guess this like goes into the policy of like pushing for vegetation in our cities really helps at least try to minimize some of that heat that's captured in our concrete settings. So yeah.
Thank you, Bridget. Anne?
So I'm going to answer for our group.
Thank you, Donna.
And That's no problem. So I had a question actually, because I live out in Picture Rocks, and in Picture Rocks, there are a lot of manufactured homes. And I know that they're hugely energy inefficient, but I also know they're really affordable housing. So I was just wondering actually if there was anybody thinking about manufactured homes and energy efficiency. And then we discussed, as other groups did, how we could facilitate a program in the city to retrofit houses. We talked about that. I think that's already been discussed and how it would be funded. And then I also think that if the city doesn't get involved in a sort of hands-on way, that I do think education is something that the city could do and really make a difference in moving this forward. And thanks to Trace, I think what he's doing is terrific.
Right. Well, in fact, Trace is the lead author on the green retrofit proposal, which has been, we've sent it to Ann Kirkpatrick's office. I think it's mostly going to serve to them as an FYI. It's also gone to the city of San Rafael's climate advisor and we'll be meeting at the end of June with the Pima Community College workforce development team to discuss how they could engage with that. So that's the ideas that we're capturing here, I think can have feet. And if you would be interested in that particular conversation, even if it's just forming how we are going to talk with the workforce development team, send me a note. David and Trace and I are sort of the momentary representatives of Sustainable Tucson on this, but we want to spread our net wider and get all the good ideas and participation. And Laura, I'll make sure to keep your question. We'll send that to David because I about the well, where are we with evaporative cooling? I came away the same way as you did. It's like, okay, now do we want it or not? So,
Stuart, can I say a couple of things?
Sure, David.
So one is that sometime in the next few days, I will send you a PDF file of my presentation, and it'll be in the form of notes, PowerPoint notes. So you'll have the slide, and then below that will be the commentary that goes with it. And you'll see all those links and all that information. So that will be available to you. And I also just wanted to say that there are, a variety of things. Some of those questions, like has been a bunch of work done on manufactured housing to really make it much better. And there was also a really interesting project aimed at, and this was through some tribal work that we were involved with a little bit, but anyway, to take mobile homes and wrap them in bales and actually add on, like a greenhouse room, but basically to get those, get them inside something that performs much better, maintain the usefulness of their utilities, their utility core, there's the services they have, but take them out of the realm of being solar ovens and refrigerators.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
And thank you, David, for exemplifying for us what a true visionary does. A true visionary sees and imagines what is possible and then helps chart the path. And you have developed some of the operating instructions for getting to the vision that we have of a sustainable community. And it's already reached out nationally. And we all, of course, are eager these days to scale up. And we are grateful for your being part of that scaling up process. We know the conversation will continue.